See, Barbara is saying it was a good win. Marie is also saying so. Good. Okay, so I think we can start because we've got a full agenda today. So a hearty and warm welcome to everybody, and I can say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening because I can already see some people from the US as well as Asia and lots from Europe as well. So a warm welcome to you, and I'm going to hand over to Father John Paul, who is going to do the introduction and introduce our speaker for today. Father John Paul.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. This is our third Sunday of Easter. So Christ is risen. He is truly risen. And this is the second of our six-part series on the way to Pentecost. And we're very honored and privileged to have with us today as our tour guide and lecturer, Mr. Jared Goldfarb. And you're all very familiar, those of you that had been following our town tour and ISC presentations, you're familiar with Jared. And so Jared, the floor is yours. Or I should say, the Zoom is yours.
Fantastic. Hello, everybody. Good day from Jerusalem. Nice to see you all, or almost all of you. It's hard to fit you all in on one screen. I see some definitely familiar faces and perhaps some new ones as well. We have a relatively short time together today, so I want to jump right in. I want to make sure that people can hear me. Somebody give me a thumbs up if sound is okay. Fantastic. Since many of you know me, I'm happy to just give a very, very brief introduction so you understand where I'm coming from. I was born and raised in the United States, but moved to Jerusalem about 25 years ago and have been teaching all over this land and around the world, primarily focusing on the history of the land of Israel, either from various biblical periods or looking at the history of our monotheistic narratives, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And also I teach quite a bit about the politics of the Middle East, the various cultures in Israel and Palestine. And on a slightly different note, I also like to teach a lot about nature and ecology and sustainability, especially when it comes from our faith traditions. So not surprisingly, many of those topics all kind of intersect a little bit in the topic that we want to address today. And that, of course, is this journey that is taken somewhat inexplicably, without much introduction, from Jerusalem to the city of Emmaus. In the context, of course, of this very momentous occasion in land of Israel history, in Jewish history, in Christian history, immediately following the crucifixion of Jesus in Jerusalem. So in order to give us a little bit of context and dive right in, I'm going to share my screen and get us started on our journey. And I'll just ask one of my co-hosts if there are any problems along the way or you need my attention. Obviously, feel free to just speak up, since I won't be able to see too much of what's going on as I am presenting our little adventure here. So hopefully you can now see. Whoops, I gotta start the presentation. Minor technical difficulty. Here we go. Okay. So I've called this 7 miles from Jerusalem, and I'm guessing you probably all know why, but if not, we're going to get into that particular detail in just a moment. And given that my expertise is certainly not the spiritual experience that many of us would love to have when recreating perhaps this particular journey from Jerusalem to Emmaus, what I would like to do is use my experience and my passions in terms of the educational world to build a little context for this particular moment in the New Testament narrative. So in order to really set up the journey and provide us with the appropriate context, we're going to need a little bit of a broader look. And so we're going to start here on Google Earth with a beautiful image of the planet as we start to focus in and understand some of the geography of the story. Where, in fact, are we when we read this particular passage? Obviously, we'll be focusing on the version in the Gospel of Luke. And so as we zoom in on the Middle East and start to get a little bit closer, we are able now to see the ancient land of Canaan, or the land of Israel, if you will. We can, for the time being, ignore some of the political boundaries that you see on the map, but certainly appreciate this broad swath of brown that has been come to be known as the Holy Land, with all of its challenges. Just by color alone, we are already reminded perhaps of some of the dichotomies between desert and promised land, hill country, and seacoast, etc. So I want to zoom in a little bit further. You can already see the tag for Jerusalem on the map. And if we were to go just a little bit closer towards the center of this land, we're now able to focus on the region in which this journey from Jerusalem to Emmaus takes place. You can see over here on the right-ish side of the screen, the city of Jerusalem. I'm circling it with my mouse. And just to the west, a little bit to the north, we have one of the candidates for the city of Emmaus. I'll come back to that statement in a moment to clarify. And so let's dig in a little bit further in terms of the beginning of the journey. Of course, where many of our stories originate, we have the ancient city of Jerusalem. We're now looking at a close-up of what today is often referred to as the walled city of Jerusalem. Of course, the walls and particular size and shape and modern reality of this image has almost nothing to do with the Jerusalem that Jesus and his disciples knew. But of course, the geography is rooted in the same place, and that is this holy hill over here, now marked as the Dome of the Rock and the Temple Mount. Of course, the temple, which was standing during the life of Jesus, was not just a major attraction point for the city itself, but a very relevant geographic space for Jesus as a Jew, making pilgrimage, offering sacrifices, etc. As we start to think about journeying beyond Jerusalem, okay, we will pull back a little bit high up in the sky. And now we're sort of standing above the Mount of Olives. You can see here at the bottom of the screen, the Mount of Olives. And we are looking towards the west, right, towards the Mediterranean Sea, beyond the old city here on the lower part of the screen, and looking out past what is today Greater Jerusalem, the largest city in the state of Israel. And as you can see, as we make our way towards the west, we leave the urban density of the city of Jerusalem, and we can start to see here some a little bit more of a rural scene, right? Less populated, less infrastructure. There are certainly some smaller cities and towns along the way, but really these hills essentially is where we have our sights set for this particular path that we would like to now reimagine as we picture the disciples leaving Jerusalem and heading towards Emmaus. And one more picture that'll just give us a final bit of context for this journey. If we pull up just a little bit further, we're still just hovering above the Mount of Olives in the city of Jerusalem, but now we can see our way all the way to the Mediterranean. And just in between is, again, our candidate for Emmaus, the one that I am going to sort of envision with you today as we participate in this journey. Okay, so it just gives you a little bit of geographic context to understand some of the details, some of the finer points that I would like to share with you, as if we were walking in the footsteps of Cleopas and the other unnamed disciple as they make their way to Emmaus. Okay, so hopefully this is a good starter for people. Again, those who maybe are more familiar with the geography, this will be a nice reminder for your previous visits to the Holy Land. For those who have maybe not yet joined us here in the land or are looking forward to in the near future, this will help perhaps you just wrap your mind around where in the land we are, how far we might be going, and what's going on in the immediate vicinity. So we're going to turn back now to the presentation. And as we get set up, I just want to explain even the title, because there's something very important. While I am going to try to create as much of a powerful visual experience to enhance whatever spiritual value we derive from this particular moment in the narrative and in the text, I want to be very, very clear, just for purposes of integrity, that there is a tremendous amount of unknown regarding this particular passage, and a tremendous amount of scholarly debate over where exactly it's taking place. And the title alone gives away one of the major questions, in that, while I'm guessing some of you, at least, if not many of you, are familiar with the predominant English translation of the text in question, 7 miles from Jerusalem, there's a significant debate, like I said, around whether or not this journey is really clearly understood. So let's take a look at the text itself and just try to understand where some of the questions are, and then we can move beyond those questions to more enjoy the process of the journey. I don't want to bog us down too much in scholarly detail. So here we are in chapter 24 of Luke, verses 13 and 14. I'm sure this verse is more familiar to many of you than it is to me even, but I'll quickly read it so we're on the same page. On that same day, 2 of the disciples were going to a village called Emmaus, about 60 stadia from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. So already you probably noticed that the title of my presentation was drawn from the translation of the text, whereas here in the particular verse, I chose to reference the actual verse, which is 60 stadia, although we have many manuscripts that mention a distance of 160 stadia from Jerusalem, which gives us a range of anywhere between about 11 and maybe 20 some odd kilometers, 28, 29 kilometers from Jerusalem. And so trying to determine which direction we're headed in, or which Emmaus we might be going to, because over history there have been a number of candidates, can be a little bit of a frustrating experience. So the good news is that for us, I'm going to narrow in on the Emmaus that is largely celebrated today in the Christian world, and is one of the earliest candidates for the site that we're referring to. And so we'll be able to at least put aside, although I don't want to ignore it, this scholarly question, and really just kind of focus on the more spiritual aspect. What might we have experienced if we would walk from Jerusalem to that particular Emmaus, although the Emmaus that we're going to focus on is a bit more than 60 stadia from Jerusalem. We won't let that get in the way for now. So let's take a look here. We have a map of the province of Judea from the Roman Empire in the 1st century, right? Many different provinces around Judea that were ruled by the Romans, although with a tremendous influence from the local Jewish community, both in terms of the religious aspect, but also in terms of politics. that clearly is going to lead to some friction points that we are very familiar with along the way, and we'll have to address as well on this particular journey. And here, if you look very closely on the map that I've provided where my mouse is, you can see the city of Jerusalem just to the north of Bethlehem. And just outside Jerusalem to the northwest, we have a mark for Emmaus, right? Now, this Emmaus on the map seems to be situated about 60 stadia from Jerusalem. We are actually going to head a little bit further to the west to the most conventional site, or the most accepted site, I guess you could say, for Emmaus, which is more along the lines with the 160 stadia from Jerusalem, like I said, somewhere in the vicinity of 25 to 28 kilometers outside of the city. The good news is that predominantly all of the different candidates of Emmaus are more or less in the same geographic region. So that if we were trying to imagine what this experience was like for the disciples and for Jesus, who meet along the way, more than likely, whichever city of Emmaus we're talking about, we're going to find ourselves in a very identical situation. And so that will enable us to really just focus on the sights and the sounds along the way and not worry too much about where we might end up. Now, we do have some other context that might help us understand a little bit about the journey, right? What does it mean to leave Jerusalem and to head west towards Emmaus? Keep in mind, of course, this map helps us perhaps visualize some of Jesus's more frequent travels, given that Jesus called the Galilee home, right? And was very active in teaching and preaching and healing and miracle working around the shores of the Sea of Galilee, right? Which I'm circling with my mouse. And obviously his journeys to and from Jerusalem for sacred ritual pilgrimages, along with other reasons, the activities that take place along the Jordan River that you can see here connecting the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea. So there's a lot of relevant geography on this map, but perhaps more oriented towards this north-south axis, right? Which was something very, very common amongst the Jewish world 2,000 years ago, given that we know this archaeologically, there was a tremendously strong Jewish presence for many, many centuries, long before Jesus and even after Jesus, in the area of the North Country. So just something to keep in mind now that we're going to reorient ourselves towards the west, looking towards the Mediterranean Sea and journeying in a slightly different realm, you could say, both geographically and maybe even more importantly, topographically, which brings us to another text that we might find handy in understanding the location of Emmaus. So now this text comes to us a number of centuries after the time of Jesus, but reflecting back on a world of the early rabbinic community, which of course is a world that Jesus saw himself a part of. And here in the Jerusalem Talmud, in Masechet Shvi'it, the tractate of Shvi'it, we read, from Beit Horon to the sea is one domain. Yet is it one domain without regions? Rabbi Yochanan said, there is mountain, lowland, and valley. From Beit Horon to Emmaus is mountain. From Emmaus to Lydda is lowland, and from Lydda to the sea is valley. So what we can glean from this is that essentially from the north-south axis of the mountains, right, which is where I'm showing you a mouse on the screen right here, between that area and the Mediterranean Sea, in our text referred to simply as the sea, we apparently, according to rabbinic wisdom of the time, need to identify three distinct regions: the mountain, the lowland, and the valley. And so perhaps a topographical map will help us really feel a little bit more connected to this journey As we leave Jerusalem, you can see here marked in red in the center of the map. Note that the map has been oriented, right? So here's the north, here's the south, right? So we're not looking like a traditional map, the one that I showed you before. And so essentially, if we were to leave Jerusalem going to the west, we could follow this area right here, this route through the hills of Judea. And here on this map, although I'm not sure it was intended as such, this was designed by a good friend of mine, Emmaus, we're actually able to notice the three regions mentioned in the rabbinic text. Jerusalem, of course, sits upon the mountaintops, right? The high places. Over here, we can see along the coastal plain. This, of course, is the valley that was referenced in the rabbinic text. And then if you look really carefully, just in the middle here, you can see these smaller hills that are colored in yellow, referred to as the lowlands. The Hebrew term we use for that region is the shfela, from shefel, meaning a dip, right? Or a low place. It's not quite as low and flat as the valley or the plain, but it is definitely not a mountainous region. So you could almost see it as kind of a halfway point, topographically speaking, between the high hills and the very low coastal plain. Not coincidentally, it also happens to be the halfway point, geographically speaking, between the high places and the sea, right? So you would almost have to make your way halfway to the coast, right? To, let's say, for example, the ancient port of Jaffa, in order to reach the lowlands. And so for that reason, we're using the 160 stadia approach because it gets us to this area right here, almost the northern section of this range of lowlands, the Shfela. While looking at this map, I just want to point out another parallel that might resonate with you all who are familiar with and perhaps passionate about the biblical texts. And that is that just south of Jerusalem, there's a city called Bethlehem. And from Bethlehem, we have another very critical biblical figure by the name of David, who is born and raised in that city, who also makes a journey westward towards the coastal plain and stops also around the halfway mark in the lowlands, the Shfela, in a valley called Elah. You can see here even marked on the map, the valley of Elah. And this valley, just to the south of the valley where we will be walking today, is where the famous battle takes place between David and Goliath, which of course in our spiritual narratives is of utmost importance in understanding the rise of David, the dominance of the Israelites, and the future of the kingdom, the relationship to God, etc. But from a very practical point of view, it's also keen to understand that there are many different worlds that exist simultaneously in this ancient land, and many of those worlds are defined by their areas of residence according to topography. So you'll have the hill people, and you'll have the sea people or the coastal plain people. And the in-between areas, perhaps, are areas of either confrontation or transition. And that's a little bit going to help us also understand the story that we are looking at, which I think is very much a story of transition in terms of Jesus, the living, versus Jesus, the resurrected. Okay, I'd love to dwell more on this, but again, we're short on time, so we're going to keep moving here. And now I want to share with you a little bit of the historical context that anyone living at the time of Jesus, of course, Jesus and his disciples would have been very familiar with, in perhaps understanding the role of the region and their familiarity with the region. And so here we have a text from the book of Maccabees, book 1, chapter 3. And here, just after the death of the leader of the Hasmonean family, the priestly clan that lived and was based outside of Jerusalem, his name was Matityahu, or Mattathias in English. He has just died. And so we pick up the narrative and we read, then Matityahu's son, Yehuda, called Maccabee, rose up in his stead. All his brothers helped him, as did all those that stood with his father, and they fought with cheerfulness the battle of Israel. He went throughout the cities of Judah, destroying the ungodly out of them, and turning away wrath from Israel. When King Antiochus heard these things, he was full of indignation. So he gathered together all the forces of his realm, a very strong army. Lysias sent 40,000 footmen and 7,000 horsemen to go into the land of Judah and destroy it as the king commanded. They went forth with all their power and pitched by Emmaus in the lowlands. So here we can see that, let's say about 100 years before the time of Jesus, Emmaus, perhaps the same one, we're not 100% sure, is going to play a critical role in this showdown between one of the communities, let's just say in the Jewish world, versus this massive dominant political and military force, very much perceived as the oppressor in this narrative. And of course, the uprising of the Maccabees and their victory over the armed forces of the Western world are going to prove to be quite relevant in the continuation of the story. So why did they pitch by Emmaus? More than likely because of this particular map, right? The relevance, the strategic importance of being able to identify the various routes that people traveled to get from point A to point B, and to be able to control those routes is one of the many strategies that we see throughout the ancient world, especially when it comes to military confrontation. So as you can see here, we have various river valleys that are going to essentially self-define themselves according to nature and God's whim, perhaps. And it's those areas that become very well-known routes of movement, and therefore you want to control them. So it's quite possible that that is the reason why Judah and his forces camped out in Emmaus, perhaps getting ready to storm Jerusalem or to move up onto the higher hills and take control of that sacred ground. So what does that mean for us? Essentially, it helps us understand that when we read that these two disciples were leaving Jerusalem for Emmaus, they were probably on a very well-trodden route, one that they and their community knew very well or had walked before. And even if they hadn't, they had very little to worry about because it was probably marked quite well. And so if we look here at this map on the left side of your screen, you can see some of the very well-known transportation routes that were marked and understood during the Roman Empire. And you can see that right here in the center is the city of Emmaus, right? Perhaps the same reason that it dominated the transportation routes in the Roman Empire as from the Maccabee period when it served as a strategic spot for battle. Here is the city of Beit Horon, just to the north, that was also mentioned in the rabbinic text from the Talmud we looked at. And here you see Jerusalem sitting squarely on top of the mountain range. So when we're now envisioning the route, we may have thought, given that Emmaus is not mentioned anywhere in the Hebrew biblical text, right? We don't have a lot of references to it in any of our earlier textual narratives when we're talking about the mainstream stories of Judaism and Christianity. And so it's possible that one could think, what's with Emmaus? Why would they be going there? Why would they be sort of searching for this unknown place? But in fact, our historical context helps us understand that this was a very well-known location. Perhaps people didn't write down why it was so well-known to us, but it was certainly well-traveled. And so as you make your way from Jerusalem to Emmaus, you're going to come across these stone pillars along the way that are official Roman mile markers. You can see them actually even noted on the map. And these are remnants from actual mile markers that still stand today on the path between Jerusalem and Emmaus. So just as we might get excited, seeing some of these ancient relics along the way, helping us know that we're walking in the footsteps of our ancestors 2,000 years ago, they probably would have been just as excited, more so because they knew they were not lost and they were actually heading in the right direction. And so it just, again, helps us really experience what this journey may have been from Jerusalem to Emmaus. These are images that unfortunately are no longer relevant today because the situation on the ground has changed. But I wanted you to see that on the road to Emmaus, if you look really carefully in this big picture here, you may notice these rocks in the lower left corner and these rocks over here in the upper right corner. They look very linear. They look a little bit not so random. And that's because they were part of the border of the road that had been paved by the Roman authorities. Take a look over here on the right-hand side, and I have provided you with a close-up of those same rocks. You can see here, I'm going over them with my mouse. These were the stones that delineated the travel route so that folks would simply be able to follow with ease. And more than likely, there were very flat stones that were used to pave the way for folks that were not just traveling on foot, like the heroes of our story today, but for many of the industrialists and traders who were traversing this route with carts and such, and needed a little help to get over the rather rough natural territory. So again, just giving us a little bit of that feel of being on a relatively main road, connecting Jerusalem to Emmaus, one that was well-traveled, and so here we go. Now, if we leave Jerusalem and we start to make our way, as we read in the rabbinic text, from the mountain to the lowlands, right? What would that have looked like? What might we see along our way? Now, it just so happens, because of the lovely corona situation that has been a bit of a disaster for most of us around the world, I haven't been quite as employed as I would like to be, given that I predominantly work in the field of international education, and me being in Jerusalem and most of my students coming from around the world, they have not been able to get into the country. And so with that free time, I have taken advantage and have started hiking in a very orderly fashion, what's called the Israel Trail, which is one hiking path that connects the northernmost point and the southernmost point of the state of Israel. It's about 1,000 kilometers long. And as luck would have it, it was literally just a couple of weeks ago that I passed by Emmaus while I was hiking. And so I just want to share with you some of the photographs that I took along the way so that you could also get into this mindset of what the view would look like for Cleopas and the other disciple and for Jesus as they are making their way from Jerusalem to Emmaus. So here we're actually in the region of Emmaus looking back towards the hill country. You can see in the distance here some of the hills of Jerusalem and the surrounding area. And you can kind of, in this photo, get a sense of what we mean by the shvela, the lowlands, sometimes referred to as the rolling hills. They're not mountains, but it's also not flat. And you can see here the very kind of gentle nature of the hills, which on one hand is still a bit of work if you're leaving town and you have to sort of walk up and down over these rolling hills. But on the other hand, it's a lot more easy on your stamina than if you were to have to keep hiking up over tall mountains like Jerusalem. Of course, in between these hills, we see some of the natural valleys. And in those valleys, today, just as 2,000 years ago, you would witness a tremendous amount of agriculture. Right? There's a lot of open space as we move into the intermediary spaces between the major cities on the mountains and the major cities along the coast. And in these intermediary spaces, again, both today and in the time of Jesus, we would see a lot of agriculture. What kind of agriculture, you might be wondering? Well, probably not such a surprise. You're going to see olive trees, right? Tremendous amount of olive trees, as well. Some beautiful just rolling wheat fields. Again, these are pictures that I took on my hike 2 weeks ago. They're very relevant today and probably just as relevant in the time of Jesus. And of course, the famous grapes, right? Now, these three crops, I'm hoping you all can identify as 3 of the 7 species of the land of Israel. So it's not just a biblical passage, but it's a very real-time industry in the land of Israel. This is what sustains the communities in which Jesus and the disciples and all of the Jews of that time lived. This is what keeps them going, feeding their families, and lest we not forget, also to be able to participate in religious ritual, right? All of the various sacrifices, the drinking of wine, the olive oil anointment ceremonies, right? They all come from the very basics of the land that you would witness as you were walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus. Here, just to throw in another little archaeological remnant, is a wine press from Emmaus, right? Those beautiful grapes that you saw in the last photo. Well, here's where they would be stomped. This is where they essentially would become grape juice and then wine, also for drinking, but also for religious ritual. So very, very relevant archaeological space in terms of the story of, what one might walk by on that path from Jerusalem to Emmaus. We have literally hundreds of both wine presses and olive presses in these hills between Jerusalem and Emmaus. It is one of the most major industries. You're making it for your own community, but you're also selling it to passersby, to, let's say, Romans who don't know their way around the land in terms of local sustenance. So it's a very important part of the communities themselves. In addition to the crops, you're also going to have animal agriculture. And here is a herd or a flock. I don't know which one is correct. I think it's a flock of sheep that I got stuck behind as I was hiking on my route. Sheep are critical, as well as goats. There actually were a couple of goats in this crowd as well. So you're using the hair, the milk, the meat, right? Every aspect of the animal, sustaining the community. And of course, as you can see here, this particular guy is making use of the olive trees himself for a little bit of food. So what do the sheep and the olives and the wheat and the grapes all have in common in terms of their relationship to the land? Water, right? Part of the backbone of so many of our stories from this ancient special land is water. Both where is it, how much of it is it, and who's going to control it, right? I don't need to tell you how many stories from our various biblical episodes revolve around the role of water. And so I want to share with you another brief text that maybe helps us understand another aspect of Emmaus and the kind of region that it sits in. This is a midrashic text from Avot de Rabbi Natan. And here we read, and we're just going to forget about the context for now, just appreciate these couple sentences just for what they say. When they left Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's presence, Rabbi Elazar said, I shall go to Diamset, Emmaus, a beautiful place with beautiful and delightful waters. But the other rabbis said, we shall go to Yavne, where there are scholars in abundance who love the Torah. Now, many of you probably know that Yavne will become the first home base, you could say, or foundation of the organized rabbinic world following the destruction of Jerusalem about 40 some odd years after the death of Jesus. However, we can see that not all rabbis were perhaps on that scholarly path. Some of them maybe just wanted to enjoy the good life. And apparently Emmaus was one of those places where you could enjoy yourself. Now, what's the connection here? It's not clear from the text, but we know from many other much other scholarly research that the word Emmaus in Hebrew clearly is not of Hebrew origin, okay? The belief is that Emmaus somehow came from the word Chama in Hebrew, or technically Aramaic. Chama literally means hot or warm, and was a reference to many of the springs in the land of Israel, simply because a lot of those springs brought warm temperature water up to the surface and were very, very popular for bathing. And so we believe that Emmaus became known as Emmaus because it used to be known as Chama, which presents us with many more difficulties because there are so many cities and towns all over our textual tradition that are called Chama simply because they were home to one of the thousands of warm springs in this land. But for now, we'll just take it in appreciation that Emmaus was perhaps not just known for its rolling hills, its beautiful crops, its sheep, but also for its water. And here, another aspect of Emmaus that we would have a very difficult time not noticing would be the tremendous amount of water infrastructure that is going to show up specifically during the Roman period, the period of which we are speaking in this journey of the disciples from Jerusalem to Emmaus. So here on the right side of the screen, you can see two very small aqueducts that are going to be moving water from the springs to wherever they might be needed in the city. It could be a central area for the community to gather around and fill up their buckets. It could be an industrial installation. It could also be something like this, which is an image from Emmaus today. It's a little bit more modern and fancy than we would imagine from the Roman period 2,000 years ago, but this is a collection basin for all of the waters of the springs and the rain that is funneled in via aqueduct to this collection facility. So in the winter months, this is what Emmaus looks like in the area around the central, what was the community and what became the narrative embodied by the church at Emmaus. And so with this water, we can imagine lots of activities, lots of sustenance, perhaps lots of success of the story of Emmaus. There are many other texts that we don't have time to look at today that talk about the markets of Emmaus, right? Villages rarely ever had markets. Only a proper city with standing and a reputation for economic viability would have a marketplace. And so Emmaus needed the water to propel that economic viability. So we can really understand that what's going on here as we make our way from Jerusalem to Emmaus is not just a walk into the wilderness, but it's really a well-known, a well-trodden path to a place that most people probably knew about very well, and people often thought of it as a worthwhile destination. So who knows what that can add to our understanding of the story. A couple other quick things, and then we're going to wrap up and have some time for questions and answers. Just for fun, of course, if you have an abundance of water and you don't always know what to do with it, why not build a bathhouse? Now, while technically this is going to be a little bit later than the time period of Jesus and the disciples from the passage in Luke, this is a very nice remnant of a Roman bathhouse that is found today at Emmaus. Would require a tremendous amount of water. And so again, perhaps that's why Emmaus becomes known as Emmaus. Beyond the bathhouse, of course, as this narrative develops in the early Byzantine period, we're going to see the construction of a basilica in the village, which embodies this whole story, right? What does it mean to conceptualize the walk, the meeting of Jesus, the dinner that is had, the sharing of bread? Of course, one of the major ironies of this whole episode is that at the end of the text, which I didn't reference on screen, but I'm sure you know well, they are going to turn around and make their way all the way back to Jerusalem. Now, if you've only journeyed 60 stadia from the city, then maybe that return home isn't perhaps so daunting. But if you've come this far to this particular Emmaus, the one that we've been focusing on today, in order to appreciate that journey, that might be a little bit of a daunting thought to have to turn around and walk another perhaps 160 stadia, making your way back to Jerusalem. But nonetheless, as we turn to make our way back home, having hopefully fully appreciated the land, the nature, the wildlife, and all of the stories that surround this place called Emmaus, from the city, we look towards the west, and we can see just barely, we can make out the coastal plain of the Mediterranean Sea. Today, of course, you can see there's a lot of population centers along that coastal plain, given the role of ports, trade and transportation. But even back in the time of Jesus, as they looked from this vantage point across what we see as the transformation of the Shvela, right, the lowlands, into the valley, right, or the coastal plain, as we saw in that rabbinic text, they would have also seen some population centers like Jaffa, Ashkelon, Gaza, for example. But of course, they would probably not have headed in that direction, certainly not at this moment in time, because as we read, they turn around and make their way back to Jerusalem. And here you can see me once again on my hike, overlooking what is today famously known as the Road to Jerusalem. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we will have an opportunity to ask questions, challenge me, go nuts. Tell me what you thought of the whole thing.
So Jared, maybe just to kick us off, how many and what are the other candidates for Emmaus in that 160 or 60 stadia circumference?
Oh my. Well, I would say the two most prominent competitors to the Emmaus that is traditionally visited, the one that I focused on today, one is in a community called Abu Rosh, just outside of Jerusalem, a very well-known community of Arabs who are citizens of the state of Israel. Probably today more famous for their hummus than for anything else. But there is a church there that is able to, shall we say, tell the same narrative, largely because it's a bit closer to Jerusalem. One of the reasons why Abu Rosh became a candidate has a lot to do with the Crusaders, right? When they took charge of this land 1,000 years ago, let's just say they had a reputation for not really understanding a lot of the ancient land and the history, and certainly not anything about archaeology. And so they were often well known for just attributing names and places to geographic spots that may or may not have actually been relevant. Another candidate that is probably also well known, although not at all visited today as Emmaus, is an archaeological site literally just outside of Jerusalem called Moza. And Moza, some of you might actually recognize the name because literally just about, I want to say 4 months ago, maybe 5 months ago, there was a tremendous amount of media about an enormous uncovering of a city in Moza, totally, well, known to most of us who are involved in that world for a long time now, but very much unknown to the outside world, because who would think that just next to a city with a reputation like Jerusalem, would you have another city that is almost, kind of unreferenced or unheard of in so many textual narratives as Moza. But because Moza is about 60 stadia, maybe a little bit less, from Jerusalem, from the core of Jerusalem, it fits that particular manuscript, shall we say, or that reading of the text much better. Both of these candidates, it should be said, while many would be happy to, consider the possibility that they are Emmaus, are not really treated as Emmaus by most of the Christian world. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to focus on the one where many people visit. At the end of the day, I think many of us would agree, and I find I say this about almost all narratives that we share in this land, that while the geographic context is critical and helps us bring these stories alive, we shouldn't necessarily rely on them as facts, but rather focus on the meaning that the story brings to us, so that if perchance we're not standing in the right Emmaus, we can at least appreciate, right, the journey that we took, spiritually speaking, mentally speaking, to get there, for fear that we may not, in fact, be standing in the quote unquote right spot.
Super. Thank you. You answered, I think, also Carmen's question regarding the archaeology excavations. So that's 2-in-1 questions. Thank you.
Beautiful.
Last question. We saw a lot of water. And today, is there a scarcity of water in Israel? Because the person who's asking, for example, said the Dead Sea, she heard that the Dead Sea is shrinking in size as well.
Yes, it's nothing new. There has always been a scarcity of water. The images that I showed you today, I chose them specifically to showcase the beauty of the land. But that particular beauty often only lasts 2 to 3 months out of every year. Not that the lovely brown landscape isn't beautiful, right? You just have to think a little bit harder. You have to use your imagination because we have such a long, dry, hot season that actually is starting right now, basically from mid-March-ish all the way through to, shall we say, October, November, sometimes even December, we don't see a single drop of rain, right? There's no clouds in the sky, nothing comes. And so on one hand, it really helps us appreciate the role that water plays in the land, in our stories, in human reality on the ground. On the other hand, it also helps us truly understand some of the power of our textual traditions that, if you pay attention to them, really focus on the role of water, on the role of God in the natural system. We can understand how our ancestors were often so desperate to survive that they really believed, right, whatever the case may have been, that if they did right by God, God would make it rain in its due season. That was a critical element of the human-God relationship. So while today we have perhaps exacerbated the situation, given the number of humans that live on this land, right, far more than any other historical moment for sure, and not only that, but our desire, even though we live in the Middle East, to live as a very modern first world Western country where we're not necessarily so flexible about compromising on some of our desires, like bathhouses, for example, like the amount of showers that we take, or you name it, the kind of crops that we grow, water parks for the kids. We perhaps are not as responsible as we could be in managing our limited water supplies. And on one hand, that has created a very interesting and innovative technological industry around water. I'm sure many of you know that Israel is one of the leaders in the world in both water preservation, water conservation, water recycling, water creation, right? Desalination, for example. So Israel has become, out of dire need, one of the leaders of the world in those technologies. But you could also say that one of the reasons why we've been forced into that position is partly because we have perhaps not been as successful and not been a leader in making sure that we truly, truly understand and appreciate those limited water resources. The Dead Sea is probably one of the best examples of that. No matter how much technology we have, you can't avoid the reality. You can't avoid seeing, if you've been there before, that the Dead Sea is a disaster. It is literally falling apart. It is disappearing. The entire land is crumbling. And unfortunately, at this point, there's almost nothing that we humans could do about it, no matter how innovative we might be. And so it really puts us on that sort of shaky ground between, taking pride in the history of water in this land and perhaps not being introspective enough into how we've managed those water resources along the way.
Perfect. Thank you, Jared. That was wonderful. With that, I'm going to ask Father John Paul and Stephanie to go into the spiritual Emmaus. Thank you, Jared.
Thank you, Jared. What a wonderful opportunity to visit the hill country, the valleys, and one of the candidates for Emmaus. Jared began his tour and conversation by quoting some of the things from the Gospel of St. Luke regarding the Emmaus account. And I just want to take some time and just highlight some of that, not to go through the passage, but to highlight some points that I think are worth our reflection in light of the importance of Emmaus. We know that these two individuals were walking to Emmaus, and most likely late afternoon. And Jesus comes up and he starts walking with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. And when he asked them what they were talking about, rather than walk and talk, they stopped. They stood still. And they really talked about the fact they did not recognize who this person was. And so he was referred to as one visiting Jerusalem who doesn't know what's going on around us. And as Jesus asks them to explain in their words what they were experiencing, they talk about hopes that were dashed, We had hopes that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And then some ladies were at the tomb early in the morning. They didn't find his body. And then Jesus says to them a variety of words translated as foolish, how stupid you are, etc. But really what it really comes down to is how uninformed you are, how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. And so beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them, and they listened intently as they continued to walk. And then stay with us. It's nearly evening. The day's almost over. And so he stayed with them. And it was in the breaking of the bread that they know their eyes were opened. They recognized him. And they were able to say, after they really didn't see him anymore, when he disappeared from their sight, were not our hearts burning within us while he was speaking to us? And they immediately got up and returned to Jerusalem. And so a couple of those key lines to me say something about what the Emmaus experience really is all about. You know, in the past, especially 2 weeks, within the Byzantine office of readings and prayers for morning prayer, for noonday prayer, for evening prayer, there's numerous references. In fact, there's hundreds of references, because almost each one of those little refrains or prayers or reflections deals with the fact of the disciples were behind closed doors or behind locked doors. And Jesus passed through those doors to be with them. He enters where they are in order to really allow them to have a real experience of him as risen, but in order for him to really assist them and help transform their lack of understanding into something much more meaningful. So again, he enters where they are. And on the road to Emmaus, he asks them, in their struggling to understand what's going on, what are you talking about? And basically, I think it's an invitation for all of us, the importance of us giving voice to confusion, to doubts, to things that we're grappling to try to understand, but we need to hear ourselves voice what's bubbling up within us. And so here is this Jesus, as he enters into their reality, their disappointment, their struggle to believe or to grapple with something, he enters where they are in order to assist them, to give them understanding. In those numerous references to the disciples behind the closed doors or locked doors, Jesus is appearing probably to prove the resurrection is real, but I think he's also entering into their reality out of his love and his compassion for them, to help them understand, to open up their minds to everything he said. Because now if they're experiencing a Jesus who has been put to death, and now they probably are also questioning, well, everything he taught, you know, is that real? How do we make sense of all of this? And so he appears to them out of a real sense to help them to understand, not just to prove he's risen, although that's part of it, but to help them understand. In other words, to enlighten, to transform, to lead them to a higher place of understanding, or maybe a better way of putting it, to a deeper understanding. So closed doors, locked doors, we can understand all of that literally, But I think we also need to understand it in terms of something figuratively. Those guys on the road to Emmaus, we're dealing with a closed door. They were struggling to understand. They just couldn't grapple with it. They're kept from recognizing him. And so therefore, those closed doors of understanding are real. Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem? Again, they don't recognize him. And so therefore, a closed door of understanding, a closed door of seeing. We had hoped that he was the one, and hoped in the past tense. That reconnection with he's gone now. And so are his words also gone? Are they also meaningless? And so when Jesus really says to them how uninformed you are or how slow you are in understanding, I think it's another way of Jesus entering to where they are and just saying, okay, let's connect the dots. Let's put all these little pieces that don't seem to fit together, let's connect them all together. And as he does that, he's giving insight, he's giving understanding. And do not our hearts burn within us while all of that is happening? I think another way of seeing all of this, the road to Emmaus and the disciples behind the closed doors or locked doors, or scratching their head in bewilderment, Jesus passes through those doors. In other words, he enters their door in order to bring them out his door. He enters through our closed doors, the closed doors of our minds, of our hearts, in order to be with us and in order to lift us out of a tomb, much like Lazarus being called forth from the tomb. And so this account is inviting us to reflect on a couple of important questions. First of all, what does resurrection mean? Because we know it does not mean resuscitation. If it was resuscitation, they would have recognized him. And so what is it that resurrection actually means? What are the closed doors that we experience from Holy Week that allow us to see Jesus moving through those closed doors and into the room of our hearts? And where do we experience our hearts burning within us? So some things to think about, and Stephanie Saldana will present a few other things for us to think about.
Last week, we spoke about another kind of examine, looking back at the gardens of our lives or of our days to recognize what was beautiful, what we might have missed, trees or flowers or the smiles of children. In the Emmaus story, we also look back. We look back on what happened to us in order to see it differently. But this is something a little bit different. In the story, the two disciples are overwhelmed, trapped, and confused. Their eyes are kept from recognizing Jesus with them. Then Jesus joins and asks them, "What are you talking about?" They tell him about their fears, about the women who had been to the tomb that morning and found no body. After listening, he explains the scriptures, beginning with Moses and the prophets. As they approach their destination, he goes ahead, they call him back, and in the breaking of the bread, they recognize him. And he vanishes. They say, "Were not our hearts burning within us?" They look back and see Jesus where they could not recognize him before. Here we look at another kind of examine, a way of looking back in prayer at our lives to see where Jesus was present where we weren't able to see him there before. To look back at those moments when we felt most frightened, most scared, most alone, most overwhelmed, and to recognize that Jesus was always walking with us. To look into our lives today, to maybe see where we're scared, where we're worried, the conflicts we've been avoiding, and to find the courage to face them because Jesus is there in that closed room. Jesus is with us here. And it's not just our own lives we look back into. Jesus speaks about all of history. He's not saying, I'm here. He's saying, I've always been here. And so we can look back in history, even in the darkest moments, the scariest moments, and know that God has never left us. That's why we as Christians are so often called the people of Easter. We see hope where others don't see hope. We see hope where there seems to be no hope. And then we witness that hope to others so that they might see hope in the places where it feels that there is no hope. But how does this even happen in the first place? Well, it's a simple story. Two friends are talking to each other about what's bothering them. And then Jesus shows up. Isn't that so true? So often spiritual writers, St. Ignatius of Loyola, St. Francis of Sales, talk about the importance of unburdening our hearts when something is bothering us so that it can lose our power. It's also a story about spiritual friendship. When something is troubling us, we should tell somebody. We can tell a friend, a spouse, our spiritual director. And in the telling, Jesus shows up. And suddenly we realize, I'm not alone. This is going to be okay. Where 2 or 3 are gathered, Jesus is there. Isn't that true? Finally, it's about prayer. As Father JP was talking, my favorite moment in the text is when Jesus comes and says, hey, what are you talking about? Well, Jesus knows what they're talking about, but he also knows that they need to say it out loud. And so maybe our prayer lives are really just one long walk to Emmaus. Maybe it's just Jesus saying, tell me what I already know. Because when you say it out loud, you'll know I'm here. You'll feel me burning in your heart, and your eyes will be opened. And we can go deeper, no longer just walking with Jesus, but walking in Jesus, because Jesus is the way. Jesus is the path.
I think a great way of summarizing what today really is all about, entering into a deeper reality, entering into prayer, entering into allowing closed doors to be opened through conversation, through prayer, through other experiences. Were those disciples in Emmaus when they recognized that we got to go back and tell the others what we've just experienced? Were they going back to Jerusalem? Or were they going back to the city of God? Because we know that there's a difference. There's a transformation in Jerusalem as well. Dan Chudy has a wonderful song. It's called The City of God. Awake from your slumber, arise from your sleep. A new day is dawning for all those who weep. A people in darkness have seen a great light. The Lord of our longing has conquered the night. And so let us build the city of God. May our tears be turned into dancing, for the Lord, our light and our love, has turned the night into day. It's the opening of doors. It's the transformation of hearts. It's the lifting up, that image of the resurrection of Christ, lifting up Adam and Eve, lifting up all of those in the tombs. We too are being lifted up. And so therefore, we awake from our slumber. We rise from our sleep. And we live as a people of the Easter season.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jared, and Father John Paul and Stephanie. That was beautiful. And what a gift today has been, both looking at us, helping us to understand it geographically, ecologically, historically, and then most importantly, spiritually. I think with that, I can say our hearts are burning within us and opening those doors. And with that, we've come to the end. Thank you for staying with us. Apologies that we overran a wee bit, but hopefully all that was worth staying for that little bit extra. So please join us again next week, where Jared will be sharing with us. Now we're going to go down into the valleys together with Judas and Thomas, and then looking at the valleys of the Holy Land and trying to also see again the metaphors as we heard today as well. So thank you, and wishing you all a good week ahead, blessed week, and hopefully see you all next week. Take care. God bless. Bye. Bye.